We have breaking news to report. A federal grand jury has indicted President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, for tax evasion. Earlier this year, Hunter Biden had entered into a plea agreement with the Justice Department on 2 misdemeanor tax charges, but the deal collapsed after facing scrutiny from a U.S. District Court judge. Hunter was indicted in September by another federal grand jury in Delaware on felony charges that he lied about being a drug user on an application to buy a gun. He pleaded not guilty to those charges. CBS News producer Erica Brown joins me now on the phone. Hi, Erica. What do we know? This is fresh and new, but what do we know?
Hi, good evening, John. Yeah, so right now that we know that Hunter Biden has been indicted on federal tax charges. I'm going through this indictment in real time, but it alleges that Hunter Biden engaged in what they call a 4-year scheme to not pay $1.5 million in federal taxes that he owed for the tax years 2016 through 2017, and also to file false tax returns in order to evade the assessment for taxes for years 2018. So that's what I'm getting hot off the press, still going through this indictment. It looks like there are at least 3 counts, but I'm still scrolling through. But this is the second indictment brought by Special Counsel David Weiss's office. Federal prosecutors first filed charges against Hunter Biden in the District of Delaware, and those were 3 felony counts related to his alleged unlawful possession of a firearm. Now, this was back in October 2018 when this allegedly happened, during a period when Hunter Biden was allegedly struggling with drug addiction. Now, he pleaded not guilty to those charges in person, those federal gun charges in person in federal court this past October. And that plea deal came after the collapse of a plea agreement for these tax charges that we're seeing right now. That a plea agreement was initially supposed to encompass tax charges that also included a diversion agreement that referenced the gun charge. And if you remember, in July, that court hearing, it had a spectacular failure of this plea agreement, a lot of back and forth between Hunter Biden's legal counsel and federal prosecutors. It ultimately fell apart when the federal judge presiding, questioned the term.
And it appears, Erica, are you still with us? It appears we've lost Erica, but it looks as though this indictment is a 9-count indictment with failure to pay taxes owed for 16 through 18. Bo Ericson is joining us now. Bo, give me what you think when taking a look at this, what looks like a 56-page indictment.
Well, specifically when it comes to the indictment, we're still getting through that, John, but we have not heard directly yet from the White House or the president himself. The president has been a little reluctant to talk about his son's legal issues, but through each and every hurdle that Hunter Biden has gone through the legal system, President Biden has said he is proud of his son. And the White House has kind of been changing tactics throughout the Biden administration. First, they're really hands-off, calling this a personal matter, a family matter, relating it so far to the First Lady's office to answer questions. But now, kind of taking the issue a little bit larger here, the White House is being a little bit more aggressive, at least when it comes to the certain other issues regarding Hunter Biden, because it seems like some of the president's competitors and challengers on the Republican side try to kind of loop all of these issues together. But we're still waiting to hear back specifically from the White House on these latest charges.
But in this case, Bo, we have an indictment here from a special counsel in the connected to Biden's own Justice Department. So I could imagine, as a political matter, they might want to tie it to what Republicans are doing in Congress. But this doesn't have Republican fingerprints on it.
No, and President Biden has been clear that he has not tried to get involved at all with what his own Justice Department is doing in relation to his son. And we also heard that directly from the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He told 60 Minutes just a few months ago that there has been no interference by the White House. And so that was just a little reassurance for those watching, questioning if anything was going on behind the scenes. And we heard directly from Merrick Garland just a few months ago that he doesn't even see the president. The president has noted in public settings that he rarely sees Merrick Garland as well. And he said even that's hard to believe, but it doesn't seem like to have a lot of interaction. There will be questions about this, so we expect the White House to say something, but we just don't have that yet.
And I'm sure it's impossible to know this, Bo, but whether this has anything to do with any of the other cases against certainly with the gun case against Hunter Biden, this seems like to be a totally separate indictment.
Yes, it is a separate issue, but I think there is a larger political issue here. And looking towards next year's election, this issue has been used, Hunter Biden's legal issues and his personal issues. And this is something that I've been asking voters about on the campaign trail, John. And if this is something that they are taking into consideration, if Hunter Biden's legal problems are kind of impugning and dragging down politically at all his father. And I've been actually surprised with the number of voters who say they are following along to these indictments. And they do say that obviously Hunter Biden seems to have made some poor decisions in his life. However, the White House and Hunter Biden himself have said that a lot of these problems throughout his life are connected to his drug issues, which he says started after his brother, Beau Biden, died in 2015. And because of that, when I talk to voters on the campaign trail, John, they are giving some benefits to both Hunter Biden and Joe Biden by their standing together. The president is standing by Hunter Biden's side. And so we will see if there's any reaction to these latest indictments when we go back on the campaign trail and ask voters about them.
All right. Beau Ericson, thanks so much, Beau. CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, it's all very new and fast, but what do you make of what we know so far about this indictment?
So these are serious charges, and we have flipped from misdemeanors to felonies. John, you and I talked about when the deal unraveled, when the plea deal unraveled, that he was being offered the ability to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges of failure to pay his taxes for 2017 and 2018. Now we have many more counts. Now they are more serious. And now what really caught my eye is that in this 56-page indictment, we have right up front 4-year scheme to avoid taxes. We have the much more serious language of filing false statements. We have more serious detailed allegations like failure to process these payments from his company. We have a long bit of history here about his extravagant lifestyle and his income. I mean, the sum for me is he was hoping to avoid all of this. Yeah. These are serious federal charges. And he, of course, will be facing them in the Central District because that's where the statute of limitations has yet to run. And so just to grab a hold of what you're saying is that one characterization might have been, whoopsie, didn't pay some things. But what you're talking about is a scheme. There's also the allegation that he claimed false deductions. So that seems to be suggesting or painting a picture of a much more active effort over a long period of time to basically break the law and then kind of keep doing it in furtherance of that. This is not just some slip up. This is not an oopsies. I think you're exactly right to point this out. And the charges that he was offered to plead guilty to, well, it wasn't just a, oh my gosh, I forgot. It was much closer to that. This, as you said, we have language that uses the terms filing false statements when he finally did file his taxes. This is not a slip up. What is detailed here in 56 pages is somebody who was quite aware of the fact that he was not paying the taxes that he owed and taking affirmative steps to pay less taxes than he owed. Again, the language jumping out at me is 4-year scheme. This is what he's being charged with are obviously intentional crimes here. And the political defense is this was a disordered period in his life and he was a drug abuser, and then that's done now. How much weight does that kind of a defense carry in a court of law, if any? So there are certainly crimes for which you can say I wasn't able to form the intent. For instance, if somebody is in a drug-induced situation where they couldn't form the intent for assault, for instance, you might see that as a defense. What we see here is, again, allegations that over years, Hunter Biden took affirmative steps, not just not to pay taxes, but then actually to lie to the IRS. So will his defense team try and explain this was a terrible time in his life? He lost his brother, his marriage fell apart, he was going through substance abuse issues and treatment for substance abuse. Yes, but the indictment indicates that the prosecution doesn't think that that will be a successful defense, that they think that they can overcome that with filings, with actions, with statements, and prove that, in fact, the intent was formed to try and willfully evade and not file taxes.
And why California? The other indictment against Hunter Biden is from Delaware, as I recall. Why do this in California? And is that something that helps the prosecution here?
So why do it in California? Because that's when many of the actions were alleged to have taken place. That's also where I believe the statute of limitations had already run in Washington, D.C., where some of the other actions allegedly occurred. What we see here for federal charges, I would say the state doesn't matter as much, but what matters to me is that I was looking at the judge who was assigned. It was a judge who was recently appointed by President Trump. And we can all imagine that there will be a lot of discussion about that and whether or not that will make a difference as this case continues.
You mentioned the plea deal for lesser charges that fell apart. When a plea deal has fallen apart and then an indictment comes back that's got that seems as much bigger, to use a legal term, in this case, and that, as you have pointed out, details affirmative acts taken to subvert, it appears in the indictment, subvert the company's payroll system, willfully failing to pay taxes, this notion of claiming expenses that didn't exist. What does that then say, if anything, about the ability to plea out of this now? In other words, is that option over and this is going to trial and the president's son needs a good attorney, or is this something that attorneys can work out and possibly plea out?
I think there's a very good chance that this case is going to trial. Now, everything about this case has been somewhat unique, but when we look at why the plea deal fell apart before, it might indicate that there is some sliver of hope for another deal, only because the plea deal fell apart before because the plea had included charges for the gun offenses and the tax offenses. And I think the judge, for a number of different reasons, was troubled that those were bundled together. The other reason that the plea deal fell apart, and again, Catherine Herridge was in the room, excellent reporting that day from her, where she really informed all of us, is that there was a mismatch, a failure of the minds to meet when it came to whether or not that plea deal meant that Hunter Biden would not face any future federal charges. And Hunter Biden's team said, this is it, right? And the prosecution said, no, we're not so sure. So all of those things we would think have now changed, right? Now the two charges, or the two sets of charges, have been decoupled, where we saw the gun charges were brought a few months ago. Now we're seeing, as anticipated, the tax charges. We also would assume at some point Hunter Biden's team sat down with the Department of Justice and said, is anything else potentially coming? So given that things changed since the plea deal, is it possible? Sure. But I do think that Hunter Biden should prepare for the fact that this case could go to trial.
And last question, Jessica. You mentioned this crucial moment because you could imagine looking at this indictment or what's your thought? Looking at this indictment and then looking at what the previous plea deal was, does it suggest to you that it was obvious there were more charges coming because there's a lot more in here than before? Or does it suggest to you, and this may be unknowable, that when the original plea deal was put together, maybe they hadn't gone all the way through everything and it wasn't actually that robust and there was a lot more to find?
So my inclination is to think that both sides were aware that the charges could have been much worse at the time that the original plea deal was agreed to. And that's in part why Hunter Biden agreed and why I think he was eager for that deal to go forward. The reporting indicated that he was quite distraught when the plea deal fell apart. His team tried to get that deal back. And I think that, frankly, both sides were aware. That's often what happens in plea deals. Well, everything about this case is not typical. What is typical is that the prosecution would say to you, we could charge you with 1 to 8, but instead, if you agree to plead guilty, we'll charge you with 1 to 3 instead. Does that sound good to you? And then you say some version of, yes, thank you, and let's go to court and have a federal judge bless it.
Jessica Levinson, we're very grateful for you doing this all on the fly, and as it's happening, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now. Well, Nancy, what have we heard from the White House, if anything?
We have heard absolutely nothing, John, and that is not surprising because they try to say as little as possible any time that Hunter Biden's legal travails come up. We've actually already been given a no comment, essentially. We were directed to DOJ or Hunter's representatives if we want any further information. It's partly because, obviously, it's not a great storyline for this White House, but it's also partly because they've gone to great lengths to make it clear that they are not trying to interfere with the case in any way, that the president isn't trying to put his thumb on the legal scale here, and so that they tend to keep as great of a distance as possible.
And so, Nancy, it seems very likely that there will then be 2 cases in which the president's son will be defending himself in an election year. And what I know the White House isn't talking, but help us think through with wisdom what the political consequences of that would be. And we've also got, of course, House Republican leaders noodling or moving forward on an impeachment investigation that will bring the president in. He's not mentioned at all in the 56-page indictment. There's no suggestion at all in this official proceeding. But nevertheless, things get mixed up in a campaign. What's your thoughts about this now at least 2 cases going on in the middle of a campaign year?
Right, and this is obviously a legal escalation for Hunter Biden, so it ensures that that he will stay in the news. It also makes it harder for the president and those around him to argue that that Hunter's legal problems, his tax problems, simply stemmed from the fact that he was distracted, that he was dealing with substance abuse issues at that time, and that he has turned things around and really working to bring his life to a better place, because these new charges, as you've been laying out, indicate that perhaps he went to greater lengths than previously believed to avoid paying taxes during a number of years. And so that's challenging. At the same time, as you point out, Hunter Biden is not the president. Joe Biden is. And when I've spoken to some of his aides in the past, they've made the case, look, at this point, the voters know, and they certainly knew before 2020 about Hunter Biden's problems. They knew about this the first time that Joe Biden ran for office. They knew about his tax problems. They knew about his addiction problems, and they elected Joe Biden anyway. And they believe that in some ways this will just be more of the same. On the other hand, the White House is trying to create this bright line, this separation between Joe Biden and his likely opponent, Donald Trump, and all of his legal problems. Well, it just gets more difficult to draw that line when a close family member of the president's, again, not the president himself, but a close family member, has some legal problems as well. Although I should point out they pale in comparison to some of the things that the former president has been charged with. Right.
Although you can imagine them not wanting to get into that fight. I mean, obviously, they preferred to keep it on the problems of the previous president, and though there's no suggestion at all that the current president is involved in any of this, right. It does get messy. And do they have a strategy beyond no comment? This is all, this is all kind of on Hunter Biden. And then I'll just add to that, if I may, Nancy, has the president says he loves his son and he's proud of his son for overcoming the addiction problems that he has. But is there anything in this indictment that might create problems for anything the president has said in the past about his son's innocence or or anything like that in terms of just the details of what the president has said as he's characterized, which he hasn't much done, but this phase of his son's life with respect to any of these tax issues?
Right. Interestingly, he has kind of moved away from proclaiming his son's innocence. He did that more than a year ago, and it's clear that he got some legal advice not to say that, because he hasn't said it again. He has continued to defend his son and say that he's turned his life around, that he's really proud of him, that he loves him, but he no longer says he didn't do anything wrong. And again, that's because there was this concern that if he said that it might appear that he was trying to signal to his own Department of Justice, hey, don't go after him. He didn't do anything wrong. Right. To the contrary, the Biden team would argue not only did he leave David Weiss, U.S. Attorney in Delaware, in place when he took office, which he didn't have to do, but then he also allowed his Attorney General, didn't stand in the way when his Attorney General decided to elevate David Weiss to special counsel. And so they argued that all of that is proof that they have nothing to hide and that they're not trying to interfere in any way, unlike the way that Donald Trump conducted himself when he was in office. But there's no question that it's a topic that they don't want to talk about, and clearly they know that whether Joe Biden is mentioned in that indictment or not, that congressional Republicans will pick this up and run with it and use it as a new fodder in their campaign to try to impeach him. Even though the White House has made the case, look, a lot of the things that he's been accused of by congressional Republicans simply didn't happen. There isn't evidence to back up the fact that the president profited in any way off of his son's business dealings, and they argue that that's going to be, what prevents any impeachment from sticking at the end of the day if it even happens.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now again. Jessica, we got more questions for you.
Great.
What do we? It's hard to know what the evidence is, and I know this is all very fresh. But do you see? What it looks like when they've got the goods in an indictment. What can you tell about the evidence that matches the allegations? I guess is the question I'm asking.
So one of the things that you and I talked about is that everything about this indictment indicates that Hunter Biden didn't just accidentally forget to file his taxes. And I'm trying to speed read through the indictment here, but it indicates to me that there's evidence that Hunter Biden knew and was reminded and actively failed to file his taxes, that he was reminded over and over again by associates, by his accountant, that he only late filed because he was involved in civil contempt cases. And so that he was essentially dragged kicking and screaming into filing. There also appears that there will be evidence that Hunter Biden engaged in, to use their words, an extravagant lifestyle. And so there's kind of logs, tables in the indictment that indicate that there will be evidence presented that he spent a lot of money on clothes, on education, on cars, on housing. And what they will then say, according to the indictment, is he absolutely had the money to pay. He absolutely decided not to after being reminded time and time again that he should. And then when he did make filings, they were false filings. So, John, to get back to your question, I think we're going to see a lot of emails. I think we're going to see a lot of receipts at the very least.
Do we have any sense of what kind of penalty we would be thinking about here? Or is that possible even to know looking at this?
It is possible to know. Honestly, a little bit more time would allow us to ensure that we give the accurate answer. But the short version is that a charge like tax evasion is a felony. It carries up to 5 years in federal prison. And we have a number of different counts here. Again, to compare and contrast to the plea agreement, what we had was 2 misdemeanor charges And those charges carried with them a maximum penalty of 1 year in prison and up to $100,000. So what we're looking at here, my best guess, is the possibility of decades in federal prison. Of course, important for all of us to remember that even when that's the maximum possibility, that is not the typical sentence that is generally handed down. In this case, we would need to go from the indictment to a conviction to a sentencing.
Right, but very helpful, both your correct warning that this is all new, but helpful to know the magnitude we might be talking about here, and particularly with respect to that plea deal that fell apart. Now, to the idea of a defense, do any possible defenses rise up to you out of this document and out of what Hunter Biden is now facing?
So I think one of the things we might see is Hunter Biden arguing, I just didn't have the money to pay, which is not a great defense, but in part because the indictment is trying to anticipate the possible defenses. And so by spending a good deal of time saying he made this much money, and it details the sources of the income and the amount of the income, and saying, and he had the ability to pay, that indicates to me that there might be the possibility that they think one defense would be, I just couldn't do it. Now, the solution, if you just don't have the funds to pay your taxes, isn't to try and hide from the IRS, of course, but to try and work with them to create some sort of payment plan. And it does not appear that that's what happened in this case. John, you and I talked about previously that one defense could be that this was a hugely problematic time in his life. He was abusing drugs. He was trying to get treatment, and that they would try and undercut some of the charges by saying he simply was not in control of his finances and his paperwork in the way that you would need to be in order to form the criminal intent to be found guilty. Again, I'm not sure that that is a great defense, given that we're not talking about one isolated incident. We're talking about a 4-year scheme, and we're talking about many different actions that were allegedly taken by Hunter Biden, many steps along the way, where he could have, according to the indictment, decided to take another path, but instead took this path, which again led to this 56-page indictment.
Right. Sins of omission versus commission. If you admitted to do something because you were kind of out of it, then committed all of these various things, it showed you at least had the wherewithal to take all of these actions that are alleged, which undermines the idea that you didn't have the wherewithal to do the legal things. Now, of course, we're just looking at an indictment. We're just looking at an indictment, so this is one side of the argument. But I'm just basically recapitulating what you've said in terms of how weak it will be to claim that this was a kind of a lapse because there are affirmative actions taking place. What's next now in the way this goes? Well, just what's the next sort of stage in this drama?
So, John, you and I talked about the possibility that they could try and enter into plea negotiations. I have the strong feeling that the sides have been talking and that those negotiations really didn't go anywhere. So what's next in the case is for there to be an exchange of evidence. There will be motion practice. We have, as viewers, become strangely familiar with the pattern of federal criminal cases. And so there will be fighting about what evidence would be admitted into trial. There could be fighting about what experts, if any, will be there. There could be fighting about what testimony would be allowed. And then once all of that is decided, I think that there will be filings for motions for summary judgment. Again, both sides saying we don't even need a jury in this case. And then ultimately the case could go to jury and to a verdict and then to a sentencing.
It appears the indictment lists at least five business associates, pawing through it here. First of all, what are the possibilities with that? I mean, we know from other indictments that have been in the news with unnamed co-conspirators and unnamed players, they are sometimes used to make the case against the primary person. Sometimes they don't want to do that. What do you think is the is the possible outcome of these 5 different business associates, or are they just part of the narrative and they're not likely to be a major part of the case?
So I think the answer is we don't know. That they could be part of a larger narrative, and or they could be people who are cooperating with the prosecution and desperately hoping that they don't see themselves on the receiving end of an indictment, that by providing information in this indictment, they potentially have an agreement that they have immunity or that they will not themselves face indictment. I mean, the fully transparent answer is I can't tell at this moment from looking at the indictment whether they're part of a story or whether or not they are a key part of this story, and we may be talking about them as indicted co-conspirators.
And I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the late filing payment, because he did, Hunter Biden did pay, but your point was that, again, with respect to the narrative in the indictment that lays out a set of affirmative acts, that the late payment was not an affirmative act because he kind of wanted to, but it appears from the language of the indictment that he was kind of forced into it or motivated by something else other than, motivated by something else.
Right. I think the narrative here is that he was dragged kicking and screaming into making any payments because he was involved in other litigation and the tax filings came up in that litigation. Not that he woke up one morning and said, my goodness, I've been derelict on my filings. I really need to get on this. And so that is part of the story that the prosecution is telling here of somebody who is functioning at a high enough level to make a lot of money, spend a lot of money, fail to pay taxes. And then I do think it's important, those 2 counts of filing false statements. That is, again, not a mistake. That's not a negligent act. That is forming the criminal intent to willfully try to evade paying taxes. And you see throughout the indictment, the prosecution makes it very clear, and that was absolutely a legal obligation. And again, what I think undercuts the argument that, well, this was a terrible time in his life is the idea that he's lying on the filings and that he's able to take that affirmative step. Again, we're looking at this from one side. This is just the indictment. But if you're taking steps with respect to the payroll of your businesses to try and evade taxes, I think that undercuts the claim that you're simply not able to take care of your finances at all.
Jessica, there has been a lot of characterization of the thoroughness and the robustness of federal legal action taken against a variety of people. When you look at this indictment and what's in it, is this the full weight of prosecutorial work here? Characterize it for us in terms of this notion of 2 kinds of justice.
So this is not bare bones. I mean, this is a serious indictment. It lays out the counts, as it always does. It lays out the story. And every prosecutor has a slightly different style, and every office has a slightly different way of laying out these indictments. But this is not bare bones. This gives us a very full picture of what the prosecution, what the Department of Justice has been looking into. And I think it will be very difficult for people to say this is anything but a serious case against Hunter Biden. And I heard your previous conversation. I think this is part of the reason why President Biden had stopped saying my son is innocent and started saying instead, I support my son. That is a very important distinction that we see.
Jessica Levinson, we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.